Monotype.
The tour guide is like, can y'all say Adobe? And then the people are standing there and they say, Adobe.
That's so lame.
Adobe. Can you say that with me? Adobe.
Adobe. Hey everyone, welcome to Creative Characters. As maybe you could tell, we are switching it up this week. I'm Bill, and I am joined by my wonderful friends and colleagues, Carl and Cadley, whom I'll turn it over to you in a moment. But this week's episode is interesting because not unlike Pee-wee from the clip, we at Creative Characters went on our own great adventure to Adobe MAX a few weeks ago. And as a result, this week's guest is you, the creative community. Carl, do you want to tell a little bit about what people can expect from this episode?
Sure, yeah. So we did something we have never done before here at Monotype, which was take this whole podcast operation, pack it up, and go across the country with it. Our good friend and fearless producer, Chris, who lives in LA, met us at Max, and we basically turned him loose with all of his recording gear, and he went and spoke to anyone who would speak to him, people waiting in line at our booth, speakers and guests at the conference, Monotype folks, and we came home with something like 8 or 9 hours of audio that we have painstakingly edited down for you. And it was a great time. I think, Cadley, you can probably paint the picture a little bit for people who've never been to Max. Like, what was it like there?
Yeah. So first of all, it's massive. Thousands and thousands of designers and creatives taking over the LA Convention Center for 3 days. We had a huge booth, multiple different activities going on. So we had a type lab, we had some hand lettering stuff. There were some really amazing sessions throughout the week. Steve Aoki was there. So there was quite the DJ dance party with surrounded by cookies and cupcakes. So yeah, it was very stimulating in a lot of different ways, intellectually, visually. Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah, and our booth was right next to Mr. Aaron Draplin's booth, and I can confirm he probably hugged about 4,000 people during the 3 days we were on the floor. He had a selfie line that never really slowed down. So he's a good dude. But anyway, I think, we're excited to share this episode because there's probably in total about a dozen or more voices represented. And, Adobe MAX is a real slice of the creative industry. You've got people just out of college. You've got really experienced and world-renowned designers and sort of creative leaders. So we were able to talk to quite a few people. And I think what we've captured is a pretty good sense of where the design industry, the creative community is right now. So why don't we kick it over to our first round of guests. And we really hope you enjoy this episode. We're really, really proud of it. Thanks.
What are you most excited about for this event for Max?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying seeing the new tech out there and also, getting to meet your heroes. It's cool to see stuff in person when you live behind a screen 24/7.
Networking, collaborating with like-minded people.
I am here at this conference to learn about all the cool digital art tools that I can bring back and share with my students.
I came here with very few preconceptions, also knowing that this is the first one in several years that's live. And so, what I want to get out of it, just human interaction with other creatives. My name is Thomas Rickner.
My name is Lily Walker.
Kimberly McLeod from Denver, Colorado.
I'm Alana Bynes Richardson. I am repping the East Coast here from New Jersey. I'm a marketing coordinator.
I do creative directions.
I do a mixture of photography, design, video, and I kind of try to mix them all together.
I've been in graphic design for a long, long time.
Is this your first time at Max, or were you here in 2019?
This is my first time in person.
This is my first Adobe MAX.
It's my first Max, so really happy to be here.
It was my first Max too, and yours too, right, Carl?
It sure was. I was joking probably too much that I've helped plan 5 or 6 of these at Monotype, and I've never gotten to go. So I was really excited to finally see what it was all about. Monotype alone, we had, 30 people from London, from Berlin, from all over the place. So to actually hang out and get dinner and stuff was nice. And I think one of the themes that emerged from talking to people waiting in line at our booth and just around the conference was that sense of like, finally, and we're back in a room together, meeting people and having conversations in person.
So it was not my first Max, but it was really different than the last one they did in person in 2019, namely because there were, I believe, 15,000 people there in 2019, and there were only 6,000. To say only, it was still quite a big event. But one of the things that afforded us the opportunity to do was to do something that was a little bit more immersive in our booth. Kathy, do you want to tell a little bit about what the experience was in the booth that we set up at Monotype?
So part of our booth was a type lab, which drew quite the crowd. So people waited in line for, at some points, an hour or more. So to give our listeners some context, this year, Monotype did a study with a company called Neurons, where we tested the impact of different typeface styles on people's emotions and also looked at their brand perceptions. So we shared the results earlier this year, and we got some shout outs in places like Print Mag, Fast Company. I even saw Abbott Miller speak about it at Typographics, which was really rewarding. So as we saw the design community's response to all of this, we were like, this is really a solid thing to test out at Max. It's the perfect audience. Designers care about typefaces. They often have the strongest opinions about them. So it made sense to kind of create an activity that people could experience in person this year.
So in addition to the Type Lab at our booth, we also had a speaking session where we delivered some updates and some background on the Neurons project. And Marie, who any frequent listeners will recognize from past episodes, was one of the leaders on this project. So she and Terrence from our studio team gave a really great talk to like 700 people about this project and what we've learned and some of the research we have planned. This project really set the tone for a lot of what we were up to at Max. So we thought, well, a great place to start would be talking to people as they waited for the Type Lab activity or came out of it to get a sense of what they were expecting and what they experienced.
Hi, so what are you waiting in line for right now?
I'm waiting to see how my brain reacts to type.
It looks like users are connecting to a computer and being hooked up to a headset that reads their emotional reactions to different fonts that they're being shown.
The guy told me they're going to read my brainwaves to tell me what I do and don't like.
Do you have any expectations before you walk into this cerebral experience?
I'm really curious to see like what my emotional reaction is versus my personal preferences. Like, do they actually match up, or am I lying to myself?
I'm expecting a life-changing typography experience.
I expect to be blown away.
I think the more curvier the typefaces, I'll be more excited.
I'm trying to clear my head as much as possible because I really want to challenge the way that I think about type.
I'll be like embarrassed because I'll love Comic Sans or something.
I want to know if I get angry seeing some kind of like Helvetica or something.
I'm really scared that they're going to show Papyrus and it's going to show me like loving it. I'll be like, oh my gosh, that's not who I really am.
Man, people were really curious about this experience. Kelly, for people who weren't there, you want to kind of describe how it worked and what it was like? Because you and I, we both did it too, right?
Yeah, so we had a little lab set up. So people would come up to the booth. The first thing they did was type in their name. We then helped fit them with an emotive headset. And they were told to sit back and relax and kind of like focus on their emotions as they watched their names show up in 5 different typefaces. Those were randomly generated from a group of, I think, 25 total. So different people saw different fonts. And then throughout the activity, the headset was measuring and scanning their brainwaves, looking at 6 different emotions: excitement, intrigue, whether or not they were calm, curious, serious, or frustrated. And it was also kind of testing the level of that emotion. So whether it was strong, weak, or somewhere in the middle. All of these measurements were then taken and generated in a heat map. So I think that they got the life-changing typographic experience that they wanted.
They also got a t-shirt.
They did. So yeah, Carl and I both got our brain scanned, and my outcome was a little embarrassing. More on that later. But yeah, Carl, what did you find with yours?
Mine was interesting because, I kind of knew how this was going to work, but I didn't know what typefaces we had selected. So I sat down curious to see what typefaces I would be shown. And then when I got my results, my highest score for each one was curious. So probably it wasn't the deep insight into my psyche that I was hoping for, but it also seemed accurate because I was legitimately curious. But as everyone knows, no one has stronger opinions on typefaces than designers. So what better place to gauge people's reactions than at Adobe MAX?
Do you have a favorite font?
The first thing that comes to mind is Playfair.
I really love Montserrat. My favorite's Avenir. I love Avenir.
Oh, Avenir.
Yeah, that's a nice one.
I like Poppins.
I love them to have a little texture or a little like movement to them.
Mine changes like every week.
If there was one typeface that you could erase and never have to use again, what comes to mind?
Times New Roman. I hate time because I have to write so many papers in that. I know that's such a college kid's answer, but I hate it.
I mean, the stereotypical answer is like Comic Sans, right? Or papyrus. So one of those two. Probably papyrus.
Man, people do not like papyrus.
Poor papyrus.
Papyrus is like a great thing for me as somebody who works at a font company but has a lot of friends that don't understand what fonts are, because it was immortalized in the Ryan Gosling SNL sketch, right?
Yes.
Avatar, the movie from like 9 years ago?
Yeah, he just highlighted Avatar, he clicked the drop-down menu, and then he just randomly selected papyrus, like a thoughtless child just wandering by a garden, just yanking leaves along the way.
It's an easy one to point to where people are like, oh yeah, I could see why fonts are important to people if they're not designers or brand people.
So if I'm not mistaken, most of those answers were as people were going into the type labs.
Yeah, these were captured as people were heading in. And, I think as we've said, in some cases, these people were sitting in line for upwards of an hour. So they had a lot of time to think about the emotive qualities of typefaces and what it would say about them and their personalities. And so it didn't really surprise us, I think, that the reactions were so strong, ranging from intrigue to also potential embarrassment. And I think Marie at one point had said to me, one of the funny things she was noticing were people saying, I don't agree with that outcome. And she would say something to the effect of, well, your brain said this. We don't, we don't know. I don't know what to tell you, kind of thing. So that part was very funny.
You learn about yourself and sometimes the truth's uncomfortable. But anyway, let's hear what people were saying after they had gone through our type lab experience.
I had very visceral reactions to 2 of the fonts, and I was surprised that my brain was actually curious about them instead of showing active dislike for them. The one I liked the least, they gave me a printout of so I could take it home and relish it in my downtime.
My outcome was curls makes me excited, so don't really love, pretty embarrassing.
The fonts that I reacted to most strongly were the ones that I had the most interest in, that I had the most invested reaction, emotional, visual. There's an emotional response to typography, and this validates that.
Because this is literally neuroscience, so yeah, it was good. It was a good experience. Worth the 1 hour line.
So overwhelmingly, people really enjoyed the experience, but there were some funny kind of reactions to it or insightful reactions to it. There was one gentleman I spoke with who pointed out that having waited in line for more than an hour, he was just frustrated going into the experience, and that could have biased or tainted the results. He suggested that we set some sort of experimental framework where we look at people's reaction who waited for less than 30 minutes versus those who waited beyond an hour. There was also somebody who was really concerned about what we were going to do with the data and if we were going to be using it for some malintent. But I assured him that, there was no sort of identity stealing or mind control things that were going to be levied against him. So there were some funny reactions to it as well.
I can assure everyone that all of the memories we stole are being properly handled.
So beyond all these cool, quirky experiences people were having at our booth, there was another major reason why we kind of set up this type lab, and it ties back to the research that we mentioned earlier that we did with neurons, testing people's emotional reactions to different typefaces. So Marie and Terrence actually presented the findings of this study to a pretty packed room, and a lot of people came out of that wanting to come back to the lab and have this experience for themselves and see how they reacted to typefaces.
Yeah, and the energy that came out of that session was really wonderful. And in fact, our producer was outside the session and caught an interesting reaction from one attendee immediately following watching the talk.
I'm Michael Marylander. I'm from New York, New York. So I've had 2 sessions so far, and by far the monotype session that I just went to on neuroscience and type has been the better of the 2. It's really, really exciting as someone who feels a lot of emotions about type to be able to think about it in a quantifiable way. I do a lot of creative consultancy around branding for small business owners. And a lot of these people have no experience with branding or marketing, and so they'll have opinions about type but won't be able to necessarily like speak out the way that they feel and why. So being able to not just say, well, in my experience, this typeface evokes X response, to be actually able to say, well, in studies, we've shown that this actually evokes this specific connection for people, and this can actually really amplify X quality about your brand if you go this route, is such a useful thing to be able to do, especially for people who are more on the crunchy, numbery side than I am, who is very wishy-washy, humanities, arts kind of focused.
I can't tell people how gratifying it is to hear that kind of response, because I think that's really the goal of this study, is to provide some actual science behind the emotional reactions that we know people have with type. And I think if you don't work with type every day, it can be hard to articulate why certain typefaces make you react a certain way. So to be able to point to some numbers and some research and say, this is what you can expect from this kind of style, I think really elevates the role type plays in branding and can help people relate to it more.
Yeah, I think you could tell it energized people, because those folks, the designers, the brand people who are really trying to advocate for the role of their brand or the role of design in a big business or in a small business even, it gave them some firepower, to use. It was interesting too to just see the response to that Marie and Terrence, who delivered that talk, just the response they had in engaging with the community. It wasn't easy because they were mobbed by people, but Chris, our producer, was able to catch up with Marie to get her perspective on how it went as well.
Hi Chris, it's so nice to be with you in real life. Many people won't know this, but I've worked with Chris for a long time and we've never met, so it feels kind of surreal to be at the same table as him recording this. This year we set out on a big mission, which was to explore the neuroscience of type and how people's brains react to different typefaces. There's been a lot of work on the psychology of color and what happens to your brain looking at different colors, but fonts have been relatively unexplored for now, and we want to change that. So this year we started testing different words, different typefaces, and analyzing people's reactions to that. So we're showing the first study as well as a sneak peek of other studies that are coming up. The response to the first one was so good and unexpectedly positive that we've definitely started testing more. I can't really say much more, but I will very soon. So if you keep checking us out, and if it's a topic that interests you, please, keep looking, because we're not stopping.
And so in your presentation on this study with Terrence, I felt like the main thrust of it was that this study is starting to now generate data to back up the argument that type matters and that type has emotion attached to it.
Yeah, totally. We came into this not blind, but almost, we didn't really know what we would find in there. And from what I've seen, the variety is huge. There's so much difference between what a person thinks and then another one comes and they do the same thing and the results are completely different. So it's kind of showing that there's universality, but there's also subjectivity. And I think that's a really interesting tandem that's playing out.
Some people will come out of this neuron experience and they will agree with what the science is telling them. And then you'll have someone come out and they will say, I don't agree with anything that this chart is telling me. I can't stand these fonts, but the brain graph is telling me that I do like them. And I just think that's fascinating.
When it comes up, people say, ooh, papyrus, I hate this. The brainwaves say something else. They find it intriguing or they're curious about it. And we've seen that happen many times, actually. And I think an important difference to make is this experience that we're having in the booth is very different testing to what we've done in the previous studies, because the previous studies were self-reported results. So it's showing stimuli to people and then asking them, how do you feel emotionally about this? It's answering a question. There's no question. You can't lie. It's just plugging your brainwaves straight from your brain. So I think that's an important difference to make as well. And I think there's a big space which exists between those two things. And our job is probably going to be to explore it. And it's kind of a minefield out there. But as Terrence said in our talk yesterday, think of it as a big telescope, the big James Webb telescope. You have to take one picture to start. And it's not going to be the best one. It might not be the most interesting one, but you've got this amazing new tool and you've got the whole of space and you just have to start. So we're starting.
I love that.
I think that the papyrus example is like Nickelback. Like everyone talks about how much they hate Nickelback all the time. And I'm always like, they sell out every show they do. They do tour, it's sold out. I think you actually like Nickelback, but everyone talks about how much they hate it, that people feel compelled, this groupthink, to agree that they hate Nickelback, even though Nickelback just creates absolute bangers all the time. And I think that's maybe what people are experiencing with Papyrus.
It's comforting, it's familiar, it's everywhere.
Ultimately, like, fonts sit and typography sits at the center of the creative process, certainly for designers, and human emotion and our own personal experiences play into this. They're all very critical parts of the creative process, but they're really hard to articulate. And there's like a level, I think Marie says that there's a level of universality. There's also a level of individuality, that plays into the way people will feel about something. So to be able to quantify that, it's kind of like a weird creative therapy for some designers who go and sit there and maybe learn a little bit about themselves, but also surprise themselves. This is very interesting to see how people felt coming out of that experience.
So, while we were scanning people's brains, one of the unmistakable themes of this event was artificial intelligence. Adobe unveiled a lot of AI-centric technology and tools that were pretty mind-blowing, honestly. A little scary, a little bit weird, but everywhere you looked, no matter whether it was Adobe or other booths, AI was everywhere.
It's amazing how generative design and AI has matured seemingly overnight. I know that's not the case, but it just feels like in the last few months, it's like everywhere. And it's, apps like DALL-E are front and center. And so it was very clear that was top of mind, not just for Adobe and the impressive design that they showcased, but as you said, Carl, for a lot of the other companies that were there demonstrating their technology, AI was really front and center.
So naturally, we asked people about it.
Where do you think the role of the designer is heading?
Oh man, during the keynote today, our art director was sitting next to me and she said, "Oh no, there goes my job."
One of the themes that we're kind of hearing at this conference is AI. How do you feel about it? Do you feel like it's an opportunity to maybe save yourself some time, maybe simplify things, or does it kind of feel a bit more ominous?
I would say it's exciting, but also ominous, like a little scary.
I'm very open to it. I think it's an assistive thing. I think a lot of designers who might have issue with the sort of DALL-E generative art might not care that their sliders in Photoshop are being auto-adjusted based on a machine algorithm, right? And that really just comes down to perception. It's still a machine holding your hand a little bit to make what you're doing a little bit faster, a little bit more in line with what is deemed sort of correct by the machine.
Mixed. I'm mixed on AI. I love that I can click a button and cut something out, change the season, change the coloring, and all of those things are super cool artistically. But as just a regular citizen, it concerns me that a lot of times what I'm looking at isn't real, and sometimes things are portrayed to be real.
Would you say you're more on the skeptical side or more on the optimistically cautious side?
Optimistically cautious.
I think some people get scared that artificial intelligence is going to be like the death of the artist, but I look at it more like it's like a new tool. Personally, I love DALL-E 2. That's a generative system that I use all the time, especially when I'm brainstorming or iterating on ideas. Instead of spending maybe 3 or 4 hours creating a mock-up, I just create a text, like a sentence, and I input it into DALL-E and see what it gives me, and then I use that as inspiration. So it's kind of like a jumping board for me. Whereas some artists also use it as like input something into DALL-E and then whatever gets generated is the final art piece. But it just depends on how you use it. So I think the future is very much like approaching AI as kind of like a personal assistant or an extra tool, just like we use Photoshop or Premiere Pro, and approaching it that way so that we're still putting the focus on the artist. It's still very much about what the artist is coming up with and what they're putting into it.
That last voice that you heard was Tanya Gupta, who was a former NASA engineer and IBM engineer who now works as an art director, a digital artist. I was able to catch up with her at the conference and found her perspective on AI particularly interesting. You know, she mentioned DALL-E in the interview, which is an AI-powered art generator. You could put any phrase into DALL-E, like, you know, poodle wearing snow boots in the mountains or whatever you want, and it will generate an image for you. And you heard a lot of fear about AI as well, replacing designers. What did you kind of hear, Cadley, when you were talking to folks?
Yes, I think a mix of like fear and then also optimism around efficiency. And actually, to tie it into something I heard at Brand New, a conference that I went to earlier in October, there was a whole session around how just using AI to be more efficient. And actually, the person who was speaking said that mood boards are dead and that, you know, AI is going to essentially replace mood boards. So it's kind of just a time saver and kind of getting to the final result instead of something that's going to take over jobs completely.
I think one of the interesting conversations that will play out over the next couple of years is sort of the moral responsibility of designers to use these tools, let's just say, thoughtfully. Some of the functionality Adobe showed during that Sneaks session, which is kind of like their work in progress presentation, really kind of pushes the limit of faking reality. You know, they showed a tool that allowed you to create and move shadows and have those shadows interact with the objects in an image. So like they showed an image of a shadow being laid over a car, so they can actually read the contours of the car and then lay the shadow on it appropriately. You know, you're really at a point where a well-trained graphic designer using these tools can just make up images completely. So I think how these tools are used and who uses them and what they're used for is going to be a really interesting and maybe fraught discussion for the next couple of years.
As an aside, semi-related, I'm working on a proprietary deepfake technology that's going to allow a digital version of me to sit here with you both so that the real me can go like move to a beach in Italy somewhere and not actually be here. So I think
you're lost, Bill.
I'm trying to license that. How does that work?
Well, I think there's a lot of potential. I think there's a lot of potential, Cadley. I'm wrapping my arms around it. But when I think of AI, I'm like, you know, this could be a great thing.
Can't wait to meet the virtual you.
Yeah.
We're going to close out the episode with a conversation that I had with James Edmondson from Ono Type Company. We've had him on the podcast before. We really appreciate his perspective, his leadership in the type design community. And he was at Adobe MAX to give a talk, to do a session. And Carl and Cadley, you both had a chance to see his talk, right?
We did. Mm-hmm. It was one of the last sessions on the last day, and he brought the house down. It was an amazing talk.
Yeah, honestly, it was one of the best talks I've seen, period. So not just at Max.
So he was at Max to give a talk about typography and his career journey, but it took a much more personal turn. Yeah. Awesome. Take it away. So we're with James Edmondson, a wonderful guest we've had on the podcast before, and really, you know, one of our favorite people in the type industry. And we just wanted to get your pulse. Like, is this your first Max? Have you been here before? Kind of what are you experiencing so far?
I was here once before, but I came as a second-class Max citizen because I was like doing a workshop through someone else, or I wasn't supposed to go to the main conference. So I feel like this is my first real Max, where I'm maxing all the way out, you know, and I'm doing the loop around here. We're in the pavilion thing right now. It's all freaky. A lot of people in line for tote bags and churros, like we were talking about. So yeah, it's huge. It's, you know, 6,000 people. This is like very overwhelming, but it's cool.
And you're doing a session as well here, talking about your business and some of the similar things that we learned about in our podcast episode with you, how you kind of have built your business, what your sort of career arc has been like. What can people expect from the session? What are some of the things you're excited to cover?
Honestly, we were just talking about how we have to pre-record the sessions too, and so I finished it like 2 months ago. And then recently, 3 weeks ago, my brother passed away unexpectedly from a fentanyl overdose. And so it felt really weird to come here and not talk about that and just kind of like ignore that completely. And so the talk is a little bit about him and who he was. And he was a pretty creative guy. He had zero interest in fonts or typography or graphic design at all, but he was a very creative guy, and he was super sharp, you know? So the talk is a little bit about how he impacted my life in different unexpected ways that I kind of continue to think about him as it relates to running a type foundry, believe it or not.
Well, I'm first really sorry to hear about that, and my condolences to you. And I can appreciate that it would be hard for you to come and do something like that and ignore the magnitude of that personal experience. It sounds like you're kind of dedicating this talk and this piece to his memory.
For sure. You know, something I'm learning about this process is that grief is a really weird thing, and everyone has license to kind of go through it their own way. And you know, everyone's lost someone, and it's something that kind of unites people in that way, but we never really talk about it, and it's maybe like slightly taboo. It's not a whole lot of fun, and I generally try and keep these talks super light because we're talking about fonts at the end of the day. You know, I don't want to bore anyone to tears, so I try and make them fun, and this one is a little bit sad, obviously, and still hopefully approaching it from a kind of lighthearted point of view. But yeah, it just felt like kind of BS to do anything else for me right now.
I thought we were going to ask you about churros and stuff. So like, this is like, you know, but we get deep though. I mean, it's like you said, you can't pretend it's not happening. You can't pretend you're not a human being who's going through this stuff because it's a universal experience. And I am sure that the people who view your talk and who hear this podcast will take some sort of comfort from your experience that like makes it more normal for them to feel grief. So I appreciate you sharing that with not just our audience, but Adobe and all the other people you're kind of being open about. I guarantee it's going to help people.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I don't have a boss, you know, so there's no one to tell me what to talk about or what not to talk about. So I'm grateful. That's one of my favorite things about running a small company is I don't have to worry about how these things are going to sound to someone like higher up the chain or whatever. You know, is this the best thing for helping out my business? I don't know. But yeah, I think it's fine to be vulnerable. It's kind of an experiment. But this is kind of going through my grief in public a little bit, which is so bizarre that it is kind of cathartic for me. But if I talk about it in public, there's always someone who's like, oh man, I just lost someone to a fentanyl overdose. Or I know someone who's going through addiction or mental illness or whatever. And it's just nice to hear, even though it's sad, it's nice to hear that I'm not alone in it. So there's that part too. And we talk about fonts as well, you know, so they do come up, you know, I don't ignore them completely, and it's a huge part of my life, obviously, and it's something that gets me out of bed in the morning too, so yeah.
James Edmondson, sending you, your family, your brother, lots of condolences and love from us. And thanks again for sharing your experience. And I hope that you have a wonderful session and are able to grieve and process the way you need to.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it.
So Callie and I saw James's talk on Friday on the flight home, and the week since, like I've been thinking about it a lot and thinking about those people who express that sense of relief at being back at a conference like this and being back in rooms with people and meeting people and talking. And, you know, I think the unspoken thing there is that we've all been through several years of fear and grief and loss in our own ways. And everyone's had a different experience, but we've all shared this pandemic and everything that's come with it. And, you know, James's talk was a really poignant way to close up this first regathering of people, because, you know, really what he ended up speaking to was this sense of time passing and really owning the time that you're given and making the most of it, and, you know, loving the people you're with and loving what you do. And, you know, he's looking at it through this lens of losing his brother, you know, in this really sad way. But I think a lot of people have been through some version of that over the last several years. I don't know, it was very sad, but it was a very refreshingly honest look at the work we do in our day-to-day lives and what it can and should mean to us. I don't know, Cadley, I was almost crying in the room, so I don't know what your experience was like.
Fully crying, I was. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I agree with you. I haven't stopped thinking about his talk, honestly, since we saw it. And I think the takeaway for me was, a lot about how we're spending our time, what that means, like how we're spending our time with our friends and our family, and then also how our work kind of correlates with all of that. And, if it's not connecting in a positive way, like looking back at it and making changes in your life, spending more time, in the garage, like he said. I think a lot of what James likes to do is also like making furniture. So kind of that's like his happy space and his comfort. So making sure you're in your comfort zone. And that's, when you're making good work, usually comes from being able to do those things. So
yeah, it took a lot of guts to get up there and give the talk that he gave. So I was very grateful for it.
You can kind of tell from that interview that we were in Monotype's booth. I mean, I encountered James and we were like, it's a former guest. Let's see if we can talk to him about his session. So it wasn't like we pre-briefed on that interview, right? That we were going to talk about that or that he was going to go into that sort of experience. And I'm glad that we captured it. We talked about this off air, and Carl, I think you really beautifully summarized it. But I think that was the undercurrent for a lot of people we spoke with, maybe not even the ones that we recorded, but just people I talked to at the conference, that everyone was super happy to be back together and also collectively wondering out loud, or at least acknowledging out loud, we're still kind of not okay. We've all sort of been through this massive thing. And even for those of us who were fortunate not to lose loved ones or lose jobs or go through real turmoil, it still was hard, and it still is hard to trying to recalibrate. I think James really was a wonderful voice, for what a lot of people were feeling. And the other, I guess, funny thing about it was just being with a guest. We record this podcast remotely. We have since we launched, because we launched in the pandemic. And I saw James, it was like my height. I'm 6'5". I had the reaction I think he had, which is like, you're taller than I thought you were. We've like never actually interviewed people in person, right? So it was like kind of also surreal to like be having these conversations. I forgot that we were recording in a certain way. We're having this deep conversation.
Yeah, I think a lot of design in some ways is a labor of love, and certainly type design. So people get into it because they love it, because they have a passion for it. And I think if nothing else, the takeaway from his talk and from his experiences, to lean into that and to really make sure that as much as you can, that you're spending time with people you love, doing things you love, and make that your North Star.
And making room for fonts where you can.
And Bill, every time I see you, I think to myself, you're taller than I expected.
Yeah, that is the comment I most often get. I think that's probably a good place to wrap it. But really what's been wonderful about this episode and about the experience was having you, the creative community, as our guest. Cadley, Carl, it was a blast. And Chris, our producer, being at the event, having the chance to really be opportunistic and have some wonderful conversations with people. And I really look forward to more episodes like this.
And I look forward to another Adobe MAX, unless an AI program goes sentient and conquers us all.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to everyone who stopped by our booth and chatted with us. As always, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode, and check out monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. If you'd like more information on our research with neurons, visit monotype.com/neurons. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. And if you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype, Angelino Audio, and Marie Tabarez. Special thanks to Mia Sullivan for helping produce this episode. We'll be back with more episodes soon. Take care, everybody.